Hello there, and welcome to Let's Talk About. If you're new here, I am your host, Caffeinated Katie, and this is where I talk about, well, whatever I want. So, I got a question. What do you call it when you take oppression, religion, ignorance, paranoia, mass hysteria, fear-mongering, and good old misogyny and dump it onto an already struggling colony? Well, in America, we call that the shit show known as the Salem Witch Trials. I've always been fascinated by the Salem Witch Trials, especially the psychology of it. I have so many questions, but the main one is, why?
Tell me why.
Spectral evidence was legit.
Tell me why.
People are acting crazy as shit.
Tell me why. I never wanna hear you say
That bitch is a witch. Now that I'm done murdering your ears with my terrible voice, let's talk about the Salem Witch Trials. I want to mention straight out of the gate that witch trials were nothing new. There were ones in England, to Holland, to Spain, to Germany, to France, and so on and so forth. But Salem was different. Not only was it happening in the new colony of Massachusetts, but in just under 100 days, 24 people had either been executed or died in prison. It's important to mention that at this time, Salem was split up into Salem Town and Salem Village. Salem Town was filled with successful merchants, fishermen, people who were relatively well off, while Salem Village was filled with Puritan farmers who clung to their traditionalistic beliefs and values. Interestingly, although not surprisingly, all of the accusations came from Salem Village, while all of the accused were on the outskirts of town closer to Salem Town. And Puritans had a interesting outlook on life. If anything ever bad happened, it was either witchcraft
It's time you knew the truth.
and if it wasn't witchcraft, it was punishment from God. For what? Wasn't always clear.
If you're happy and you know it, that's a sin.
Aside from the strict puritanical beliefs and encroaching capitalism from Salem Town, Salem Village was not doing too great. It overlapped with the Second Indian War, so there was a bit of fear from being attacked by Native Americans. There was a smallpox outbreak, there was harsh winters, harsh droughts, familial feuds, and the aforementioned oppression, basic misogyny. But the most important thing that happened was they lost their charter in 1684 and was given a new one in 1691. The new charter was much stricter and gave them less rights. With all the political and religious tension in Salem, many were led to believe that their salvation was at risk. It all started with Abigail Williams and Elizabeth Betty Parris. Betty was the daughter of the Reverend Samuel Parris, and Abigail, the niece of the Reverend Samuel Parris. Reverend Parris often preached about the other, spiritual warfare, and the devil's grip on Salem, which is pretty hypocritical since he had someone considered part of the other, a slave. We'll come back to her later. Anyway, Abigail and Betty fell into fits, convulsions, complaining of being poked and pinched by unknown sources, claiming to see specters. So Reverend Parris called the only doctor in Salem Village a Mr. William Griggs. Dr. Griggs, using more guesswork than actual medical science, decided that the two girls were under an evil hand, aka bewitched. And since this bewitchment was happening in a reverend's house, Betty got sent away to live with another family. Abigail stayed, though. Soon after, Ann Putnam Jr. and Elizabeth Hubbard get down with the sickness.
Get up, come on, get down with the sickness.
But Elizabeth Hubbard was taken more seriously since she was 17 and could testify in court. Elizabeth and Anne were the first one to name names. They accused Sarah Good, Sarah Osborne, and the house slave I spoke of earlier, Tituba. Sarah Good was an impoverished beggar, and many considered her just a nuisance, since in puritanical beliefs, hard work was rewarded with financial gain, while poverty was punishment for laziness. Yeah, crazy that people used to think that back then. She had been accused of witchcraft before, so it made her an easy target. They even imprisoned her daughter, Dorothy, who was only like 4 to 6 years old. Also, Sarah gave birth to Mercy Good in prison. However, unfortunately, Mercy did not live. I think the most interesting thing about Sarah is her last words directed at Reverend Noyes. "You are a liar. I am no more a witch than you are a wizard. If you take my life away, God will give you blood to drink." That same Reverend died later, choking on his own blood. Sarah Osborne was a woman of questionable morals and was in the middle of a land dispute with the Putnams, so it put her in kind of a precarious position when she was accused by none other than Ann Putnam Jr. Tituba, a Caribbean/South American house slave, shocked everyone when she confessed, but said that she only did it at the behest of the Sarahs. Many believe that her master Samuel Parris beat a confession out of her. It's also said that after she was cleared, her bond was never posted, probably, Reverend Samuel Parris leaving her in there to rot until some mysterious benefactor came and posted bond. Rebecca Nurse, an old, frail, devout, pious, respected woman of the community. Initially, the verdict was innocent, but was overturned, citing her partial deafness as proof of her wicked witchery. Bridget Bishop. Although not the first to be accused, she was the first executed. She had been married 3 times, and some even accused her of killing her second husband, who had accused her of witchcraft himself. Martha Corey, an opinionated, outspoken woman. She initially did not believe the girls when the bewitchment happened. She thought they were faking it. She even laughed when she had heard about it. Unfortunately, Ann Putnam Jr. accused her and was backed up by her own husband, Giles Corey, saying that he found it hard to pray in her presence.
Oh, really, dude?
And speaking of Giles, one of the only men to be executed, Giles Corey was a cantankerous curmudgeon who had previously been found guilty of murder. Giles was accused because he tried to recant his testimony on his wife, proving that he was in league with her wicked witchery. But it's far more likely that it had more to do with his land. Giles had a nice big chunk of land. And at that time, conviction of a felony meant forfeiture of land, which meant that the local government would actually take his land and his heirs would get nothing. So he stayed mute. He didn't plead innocent or guilty because he knew that they had already made up their minds about him.
You're a damn witch.
Unfortunately for him, they tried to torture a plea out of him by pressing him to death. And yes, that is exactly what it sounds like. Throughout his torturous execution, they would periodically ask him to enter a plea. The last time they asked him before he eventually died, his only response was, "More wait." It took him 2 to 3 days to die. The brutality of his execution made many uneasy. Reverend George Burroughs. Reverend Burroughs was accused because of feats of strength. Adding fuel to the fire was his failure to baptize his children and the failure to receive sacrament on the Sabbath. In actuality, I think it just had to do with the fact that he was considered an unpleasant minister and was an enemy to Thomas Putnam, father of Ann Putnam Jr., who was his accuser. When at the gallows, he recited the Lord's Prayer, which is supposedly something that witches cannot do. Cotton Mather, we'll get to him, assured them that this was just a trick of the devil. After the trials of Rebecca Nurse, a frail, pious woman, and Reverend George Burroughs, an ordained minister, many started to doubt and wonder if what they were doing was right. Increase and Cotton Mather. Increase and Cotton Mather were a father-son duo of influential ministers who had political sway not only in Salem but across the pond in England. Cotton was a little fucking crazy. He was much more of a zealot than his father, always trying to make justifications for the executions and trials, even going as far as to publish books and articles on it. Increase, on the other hand, after the execution of Reverend George Burroughs, was worried that innocent blood had been spilt, and even went as far as to say, "It is better that 10 suspected witches should escape than one innocent person should be condemned," and argued the spectral evidence wasn't enough to prove witchcraft, and it required a free, voluntary confession. Governor William Phips. William Phips was a recently appointed governor who oversaw the creation of a legal structure built to deal with the sudden influx of witch accusations. It was called the Court of Oyer and Terminer, and this court dealt specifically with the witch trials in Salem. At the end of it all, the governor was swayed by Increase Mather and the fact that his own wife had been accused. He pardoned 3 of the condemned and acquitted all who were left in prison. Finally, the self-inflicted curse of Salem was broken. Many were subjected to what were known as witch tests, spectral evidence. Accusers would claim that a specter of the accused was tormenting them. Hotly debated at the time, it was basically unsubstantiated, but still somehow one of the most often used, the float test. The accused would have their thumbs and toes bound and they would be thrown into a body of water. And since we all know witches can't sink, if they floated to the top, they were left for dead, and if they did sink, they were pulled out quickly and declared innocent. Touch test. The most dramatic was the touch test. The accused would touch the accuser, and if they fell into fits or had some kind of wild reaction, they were guilty. Yeah, that was a real thing. Eyewitness account. Flimsy but still used as evidence, it was most often just to get rid of someone that they didn't like, someone part of the other. So as it would go would be, oh, someone would say that this part of the other was a witch, and that was all they needed. Lord's Prayer test. As mentioned before, witches can't say the Lord's Prayer. I don't understand the logic of why the Lord's Prayer, but that's just me. And as we know, Reverend George Burroughs said the Lord's Prayer at the gallows, so even then it wasn't really a test so much as an excuse to kill people. The witch's teat witch's mark test. Witch's teats were any abnormal lump or bump like a wart or a skin tag or even a bite from an insect. But for the Puritans, this was just proof of a witch. They believed that these lumps were what the witch fed their familiar or even the devil himself from. Like the witch's teeth, the witch's mark was a mole or a birthmark, supposedly seen as a branding from the devil. Examining an accused for a witch's teeth or witch's mark was an embarrassing process because it was believed that these marks and teats were in hidden places like under the armpit, by the breast, or between the legs. Like in Bridget Bishop's case, her witch's mark was found in the fun area. Witch's cape. A witch's cape wasn't proof of witchcraft, as many oftenly misconstrue. What they would do is they would make a cake with the afflicted's urine in it, feed it to a dog, and if the dog acted strangely, that person was bewitched. It didn't have any kind of indication of who was bewitching them. But honestly, if I was fed a cake that had urine in it, I'd be acting pretty weird too. This was often considered what was known as counter magic and was okay. Salem is a curious case because it's never been scientifically hard fact proven what caused it. There are about 5 theories that most historians agree on. The ergot poisoning theory. The only theory that's been recently disproven was one that a lot of people just were so sure of, and that's the ergot poisoning theory. And I can't blame them. It's really freaking convincing, but only when it comes to the symptoms people had. What's not taken into account is targeted accusations, the remorse they felt afterwards, the doubt. The hallucinations they had were not common with this type of ergot poisoning, and the fact that they would break out into fits on command in a place like, a courtroom maybe? These symptoms would conveniently changed to fit the Puritan view of demonic possession. And there's the glaring issue that it only impacted singular people rather than whole households, which, if you're all eating the poisoned rye bread, that would not work. It's possible that a few of the girls had ergot poisoning and everybody just went with it. Obviously, most people in Salem believed it was just good old witchcraft, fraud. Some people claim that they were just faking it. Not to mention, the spectacle they created was quite sensational, like a soap opera or something. Indian Scare. Perhaps it was the Indian Scare. Many of the people in Salem Village were refugees from certain areas that had been raided by Native Americans, and so they started to fear the witch within, biological and hormonal changes. The people who hurled these accusations were suffering from biological and hormonal changes during a time of political and religious upheaval in their village. With the strictness of the Puritan religion, these fits were often involuntary reactions to the stress their body and mind were under. Encephalitis epidemic. Many animals in Salem had the same symptoms as the afflicted, and at that time, no one in the colonies knew anything about encephalitis. Brutal misogyny and oppression. Many of the accused were considered part of the other. They were independent or outspoken or just different in some way. And reputation was everything. A girl once accused Samuel Willard, a pillar of the Puritan community, of being a wizard, and a magistrate told her, "No, you must be mistaken," and she was removed from the courtroom. And obviously, you can see by that example that women were often accused more than men, just because they were considered not only physically weaker than men, but morally weaker and having an insatiable sexual appetite, making them weaker to the wiles of the devil. But to say this was just an attack on women would be oversimplifying it. When it comes down to it, it was probably just a brew of all of those theories. By the time the fever had broken, at least 25 people had either been executed. Ann Pudater, Martha Corey, Rebecca Nurse, John Willard, Wilmot Reed, Alice Parker, Sarah Good, Susanna Martin, Elizabeth Howe, Bridget Bishop, Sarah Wilds, George Jacob Sr., Giles Corey, John Proctor, Martha Carrier, Reverend George Burroughs, Mary Easy, Mary Parker, Margaret Scott, Samuel Wardwell Sr., or had died in prison like Sarah Osborne, Lydia Dustin, Mercy Good, Roger Toothacre, Ann Foster, and possibly more. All their lives were taken by mass hysteria and fear-mongering. Ann Putnam Jr. was the only of the afflicted to apologize publicly, and Judge Sewell was the first, if not the only, judge to apologize publicly too. Nowadays, witchcraft and its practitioners are still misunderstood to a degree, but it's nothing like what it was in the past. Well, that's all for today. If you like this video, like, comment, subscribe, and as always, stay caffeinated. Not to mention the usual familial foods and basic, and the usual familial food. Not to mention the usual familial foods. Why does he keep on saying foods? Unsubstantiated, but it was basically unsubstantiated. Many animals many animals. Aside from the aside Salem town full of tricks. Damn it. Salem town filled with. Fuck. Get out, dumpling! Go see daddy.
What's your problem? I'm angry.
The new one was a lot strict. The new one was more. It was called the Koi. It was called the. Okay.